Welcome, everybody. I'm coming to you live from Jacksonville, Florida, visiting my mom. I have a live audience actually today. So if you hear any heckling, that's either my mother or my wife. Um, they're in the room with me. I asked them to be as quiet as they could, but hopefully that will go well. Actually, we came to Florida because we were going to go to the football game yesterday and the Florida LSU game, which did not happen if you follow college football. So we came anyway and are enjoying a nice visit. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we're talking about the dangers of debt as a solution. Kind of the genesis of the class is where as you're dealing with finances, particularly in a pandemic and the impact of that. So what we're sharing is just really principles that should work at any time, but particularly as they potentially impact you through the pandemic. So here's our schedule. We see we're on week 3. Week 4 next week will still be, virtual at church, and then, maybe we'll think through if we need to do week 5 differently. But currently, the plan is to continue to do it at 11:15. So again, today, dangers of debt. Quick review. We talked about week 1. That we are a steward, that God owns it all, and we're just managing his resources that he's entrusted us to. We talked about there are no independent financial decisions. There are generally 5 ways we can use money. We can live on it, we can give it, we can save it, or we pay taxes or pay debt. So really 5 different uses, and whatever we spend in one piece of the pie or one bucket or however you want to divvy up those 5 options, whatever goes into one bucket can't go in another bucket. So there are no independent financial decisions. It doesn't mean any decision to give it away or live a different lifestyle is bad. It's just, it has consequences because when you put it in one bucket, it can't go in another. The longer the perspective, the better the decision. And then, financial maturity is having that long-term perspective and being able to give up what you really want today for what might be a better future. What, as Dave Ramsey would say, live like no one else, so later on you can live like no one else. Talked about 5 principles or secrets to financial freedom. The big one is to spend less than you earn and do it for a long time, because financial success really depends on living within your means. Give generously, because giving does actually break the power of money over us and allows us to really hold things with an open hand and really think as a steward and not as an owner. Avoid debt, which we'll talk about extensively today, because it always mortgages a future. And again, I'm not saying never use debt, but avoid debt. Create financial margin, both in the short term and creating, that savings bucket where you've got some left over after you live, give, and owe. So you have margin, so you got some options, but also it means creating liquidity. So having cash available, so you don't have to just spend out what you make that particular month on a crisis, but you have liquidity and savings or emergency fund. And then finally, set long-term goals. There's always a trade-off between the short-term and long-term, and the longer-term the perspective, the better the decision. But also, setting fixed goals help us to keep our eye on what we really want to accomplish. So moving into the dangers of debt as a solution, some quick thoughts. First, I want to be really clear on that, what the Bible doesn't say. We're going to talk about just kind of the economics of debt, but then we're also going to talk about what the Bible says. So let's start by what the Bible does not say. The Bible does not say that borrowing is a sin. If you're a Dave Ramsey fan, he doesn't like debt at all. Not quite as strong as him, but I'm not a fan of it either. But even he doesn't say it's a sin. It's not a sin. It's just discouraged. It's not also considered wise. So we're going to talk about, times where it might be appropriate to borrow, but when we talk about when it might be appropriate to borrow, it should be somewhat of a last resort and not a first option. And I think that's where we get tripped up as a society, is we look at debt as a first option and not as a last option. So as you think about where we are in a pandemic and certainly great economic uncertainty, maybe there's some clarity in your personal situation now where there wasn't earlier, but if you've never thought about there being economic uncertainty, hopefully now that you can realize that that's a potential, that there might be economic uncertainty. And someone once said that economic uncertainty is certain. And so whether it's now through the pandemic or any financial crisis, there's always going to be the potential for economic uncertainty. And I think if there's one thing that hopefully we can learn through this, is to be prepared when there is economic uncertainty. So think back, if we're in December of 2019, maybe you're starting to hear about a virus, but not really putting much thought into it, unless maybe you're in the medical field. And so if you knew this was coming, what would you be thinking about? And just think about that for a minute. If you knew there was some kind of economic crisis coming in the next 3 months, when you think about finances, how would you prepare for it? And hopefully you would have thought about it a long time ago, but just now it's about to come. So how would you think about it? What would you do to prepare for it? So I would suggest that you would want to maximize your financial flexibility and minimize your financial constraints. So maximizing financial flexibility would be just some of the principles we just talked about: spending less than you earn and having margin both in the current income and current month margin, but also some liquidity and saving up. So then you have flexibility if your income drops, or even if your income goes away. Or a different kind of crisis could be that you had an unexpected expense that you didn't have enough to account for. So if any of those things were coming, how would you account for it? And you would maximize financial flexibility, but you would also minimize constraints. And as we talk about, more debt, mortgaging your future, as you have debt payments, that is predetermined resources that creates constraints. So you have less flexibility with your budget. So the consequences of debt is reduced financial flexibility. Your opportunities are limited because you've pre-committed future income to repay debt. So you've made the debt bucket bigger, that your income has to fill up the debt bucket, more than the debt bucket. So you've limited your flexibility. And along the same lines, you've created budget constraints because you can stop going on vacation. You can stop going out to eat. You can stop going to Starbucks. You can stop doing a lot of things, but you shouldn't stop making your debt payments. So you've created some budget constraints. So as we talk about debt, I'll bring Dave Ramsey up because he, doesn't like it and has a lot to say about it. And usually I agree with most everything he says. So one of the things he says is, if you say a lie often enough, loud enough, and long enough, the myth will become accepted as fact. And so as the myth is debt is a tool and should be used to create prosperity, where the truth is it adds considerable risk and often doesn't bring prosperity and isn't used by wealthy people nearly as much as people think. Another myth is that debt provides freedom and opportunity. I can remember thinking, early in my career that, to have access to credit, so I'd have freedom and opportunity. And the reality is, it's the absence of debt and the building of margin that creates the flexible financial freedom and opportunity. So I don't know if anyone recognizes this great Southern philosopher. If you're not from the South and you're under 40, you may not. But this is Louis Grizzard, who was a columnist, and I think it was the main columnist was for the Florida Times-Union, but he was from South Georgia and was very funny writer and very well respected columnist in the South. Maybe he was for the Times-Union, but the AJC, but I know growing up in Florida, the Times-Union ran his articles too. So here's what Louis Grizzard said. So my mother had some basic rules when it came to money. Spend the least possible amount of what you have and save the rest. If you have to borrow to pay for it, you can get by without it. The secret to having peace of mind is not owing a single penny. So there's some great wisdom in those words from Louis Grizzard, actually from his mom. So Dave Ramsey says financial peace isn't the acquisition of stuff. It's the learning to live on less than you make so you can give money back and have money to invest. You can't win until you do this. And so I think thinking of debt as freedom and opportunity is using that to achieve success instead of doing the hard work and spending less than you make and finding success through the avoidance of debt. So let's talk about some of the dangers of debt. Ron Blue wrote a book back in the late 90s in that economic crisis called Surviving Financial Meltdown. And he makes a quote, I know a few cases of financial disaster occurring without debt. Financial problems are magnified with debt. It doesn't mean they never happen without debt. Certainly you can have particularly a medical issue that come up, even if you didn't have debt, that could be devastating. But a lot of times, even if it's not caused by debt, the debt magnifies the problem. And as I shared before, I'm somebody that spent 40 years in the financial industry and did a lot of teaching on financial principles. So he's someone who's seen a lot of financial disasters. So before we get into the biblical principles, let's talk about just some economics of debt. So the magic of compounding works against us. And we'll go through these quickly and then we'll talk a little bit deeper. It mortgages the future. The larger the debt load, it reduces your cash flow margin and your ability to meet long-term goals. If you remember back last week when we talked about spending, it's creating the cash flow margin that allows you to meet your long-term goals. So when your debt bucket is getting filled up then it impairs your ability to meet the long-term goals in the cash flow margin. And getting out of debt is a lot harder than going into debt. We'll show you a quick example of that. And then debt creates stress and tension. So I don't know if this is true, but it's been said that Albert Einstein was quoted as saying, compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it, and he who doesn't pays it. So a lot of times you'll hear financial advisors say, you should not pay off your debt because you're paying 4% and we can earn 10% in the market. And while that could be true, the 4% you save by paying off your debt is guaranteed. And if you think about economic crisis, if you can invest for the really long term, that's absolutely the way to do it. But if you, in the short term, markets go up and down as we saw very vividly through this crisis when it crashed significantly in the summer, but now it's come back. So that's true, it goes up and down. In the long term, it may be better, but in the short term, you want to use the compounding interest in your favor and not against us. As you look at filling up, the bigger your debt, either bucket or slice of pie is, the smaller your other buckets or slices of pie can be. So as you have more debt, that means You can't give as much maybe as you want. You can't save, and could possibly impact your lifestyle. Um, so borrowing, particularly borrowing to get out of crisis, may allow you short-term relief, and it may be the only option. I'm sensitive to that and understand that sometimes there's no options. But if that's your first option, that could more likely compound the problem than create a solution. Because in this crisis, as in any crisis, who knows when or how it's going to end. So again, try to use and think of debt as a last resort, not as a first option or even second option. So here's an example of how getting out of debt is much harder than going in. And maybe this is a graph only an accountant or engineer could love, but think of this example, and if you look at the orange line of income, that's how much you had available to spend in your lifestyle. So in year 1 through 10, so you overspent $1,000, so less than $100 a month overspending for 10 years. So that means you over a 10-year period, you overspent $10,000. So assuming you put that on a credit card, or even if you had a loan and paid 10% interest on that. And so at the end of 10 years, you took a class and had a wake-up call and said, wow, I need to stop doing this and start paying off this debt instead of continuing to build up debt. I need to get out of it. So you commit to paying $1,000 principal a month to get out. So now we've got to cut our spending down $3,000. If you think about that, everybody thinks, well, if I have to pay $1,000 principal and $1,000 of interest, that's $2,000. But it gets to $3,000 because we also have to stop overspending by the $1,000. So it's not just being able to pay the interest and principal on the debt we're accumulated, it's also reducing our overspending. So hopefully this is a visual of how getting out of debt is much harder than it is to go in. And you can create this gap of $3,000 overspending to underspending either by giving up something else, which maybe you can't save as much. It has to come from somewhere. So the other alternative is to make more money. So if your option is to make more money, the $3,000 is after tax. So you actually have to earn, maybe $4,000 or $5,000 to be able to spend the $3,000 to get back on track. So as you think about using debt to solve a problem or even create an opportunity, just realize that repaying or creating a plan to get out is twice as hard as going in, or 3 times. So some thoughts about why we borrow. So they're not all bad. So you might borrow to have an opportunity. So many of us have a mortgage. So we borrowed to buy a house to live in. Maybe it's to buy a better house or just a place to live. So that's an opportunity. We have borrowed to buy into the partnership that I'm part of. So we borrowed to buy into a business. Some of you borrowed to go to school. You may borrow to buy a car because you got to have transportation to get to work to earn money. So some of those are good. So none of those are in and of themselves bad. And it could be a necessity and a real opportunity in a prudent use of debt. The second way is you could have a real emergency. You could lose your job. You could have a medical emergency. You could have a family member that has one of those. So you could have a real need or emergency that you needed to borrow and had no other alternatives. So again, if there's alternatives, better to use alternatives, but there may not be. But often, and where many of us get into trouble and where much of society gets into trouble, we go into debt because we've lost focus, because we've just got in a pattern of spending without paying attention. And it's just real easy to do things on credit card. When the bill comes, you say, I can't pay all that. It's just kind of get on autopilot. And you're really not paying attention. Or we don't have a plan. Maybe we aren't even spending more than we make, but we're not making progress because we don't have a plan. I think I shared early on, I remember very vividly early in my career, because I was told, you're starting this, but as a CPA, you're going to make a lot more money. So I set my spending based on what I thought I'd make later. I presumed that I would do that. Fortunately, that happened for me, but it doesn't always happen. Something can happen where maybe I wasn't good at accounting and I didn't make more money, or I had to do something else. But I presumed on the future, and that's what a lot of people do. And what happens then more often, even if you do make more money, you have unlimited opportunities to spend. That's unlimited. So even as you make more money, the opportunities to spend that money come at you faster than the raises come. So that's really a really bad way to think about incurring debt, is because I'll make more later. If you can't manage what you have, if you can't manage a little, you're likely not going to be able to manage a lot either. And then, we have this idea that we deserve better, bigger, better, more. I remember preparing to teach a class like this maybe 10 years ago. And I literally, as I was preparing to teach the class, I had this money, and I didn't connect them till kind of later in the class. But I had friends that I went to college with that were driving nicer cars than me. And I thought, why don't I have a nicer car? And it really was, and my car it wasn't like I was driving a really bad car. It just wasn't as nice as some of my friends. And it just kind of hit me one day. So I'm going in to teach people not to do this. And here I am doing it myself, because that's really easy to fall into that trap that we deserve better. Even if we don't think we deserve it, we can get it, and we ought to get it so we can keep up with the Joneses. And that's, again, a really bad reason to incur debt. And so kind of losing the plan or taking our eye off the ball, just real quickly, like we talked about last week, on our spending priorities. You have income. The way generally we do it is we set our lifestyle on what our friends do, or what our mortgage broker says we can afford, or all those things. And we set that first. We have to pay our taxes. We have to pay our debt. And often, like in the overspending $1,000 a year, we end up with negative cash flow because we weren't paying attention. We'll make more later, or whatever our reason is, that's where we end up being. And that creates more debt, which just compounds. We have kind of the reverse snowball of building more debt. And we may put living beyond our means under miscellaneous in our budget. So how we should think about it is in this. So as we have the cash flow margin, that's what really creates a freedom and opportunity. So, and the idea that it creates stress, even if we have the wherewithal to service the debt and to make the debt payments and still have cash flow margin, particularly if you're married, your spouse may not have the same comfort. And it's really important to have those discussions with your spouse, that the debt could create tension and stress in their life, which could also create tension in your marriage. So again, staying with the economics of the debt, here's what I would share: 4 questions you should ask before taking on debt. Is the economic return greater than the economic cost? And certainly in buying a home, investing in a business, student loans, and potentially even a car, if that's what allowed you to earn money. And again, I'm not saying I'm encouraging any of those, but that's the barrier you should consider. Is the economic reward greater than the economic cost? And is there a guaranteed way to repay? And in a house, the value of your house hopefully is going to stay greater than your mortgage, so that creates a guaranteed way to repay. And if you're married, you should have unity with your spouse. The question came up last week about giving. I believe in giving in debt, that if you're married, unity with your spouse is the very first thing. If you don't have that, you should avoid it at all costs. And the final one is, are there any alternatives? And I think we often turn to debt first, and it ought to be the last resort. Can we, even if it's, borrowing, you got to be very, very careful borrowing from family, but, getting resources from other sources, waiting till later, shopping around, are there any other options than going into debt? So what does Scripture say about debt? So let's shift from the economics, which in my opinion, in a lot of ways, the economics make it unwise, but I think it's unwise, and Scripture just confirms that. So in Proverbs 22, just as the rich rule the poor, so the borrower is servant to the lender. So debt is equated to slavery. In the New Testament, when you get a chance, read Deuteronomy chapter 28, when it talks about the blessings and curses of being obedient to God. Included in the blessings was not borrowing and lending to others. Included in the curses was borrowing from others and not lending. So in the Old Testament, I'm not at all equating it to a curse, but that was a result of the curse of disobedience in the Old Testament. And so, debt presumes on the future, and Scripture speaks to that. And I alluded to 2 Kings as the widows, where Elijah provided the oil. God provided for her, and borrowing to get out of her situation would have denied God an opportunity to do something really special. So some principles, just really avoid presuming on the future and have a guaranteed way to repay. Some biblical wisdom on that in James chapter 4. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow, I'll go this and do that, city, spend a year, carry on business and make money. Well, you don't even not know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? It is a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord's will, we will live and do that. So you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. In Proverbs 22, do not be one who shakes hand in pledge or puts up security for debts. If you lack the means to pay, your very bed will be snatched from under you. In Luke 14, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? So as you do that, count the cost and be prepared and have an ability to repay. As you think about this, I can't help but thinking, I'm sure there's tons of examples, but going back to 9/11 and then again now, I think of a pilot who's highly trained, has a great skill, a great career, but then after 9/11, planes stopped flying and they have no job. Who could have ever dreamed that would happen? And then the pandemic too. Again, thinking I got a great career, and then all of a sudden planes stop flying. Who thinks that could happen? But it did. And so if you think that won't happen to my career, then you maybe ought to give a call to a pilot, that I'm sure that's what they thought too. So don't mean to pick on pilots, but I know there are a lot of other things that you never would have thought this career would just stop. But just be really careful presuming that I'll be able to do what I do later, because you never know what the future might hold. And on the idea of denying God an opportunity to provide, again in Luke 22:24, consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse or barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you to them? So God has provided, has assured us he will take care of us. In Psalm 34, the young lions will suffer, want, and go hungry, but those who seek the Lord will lack no good thing. So there, as you think there are no options, and don't seek the Lord and really try, then you could be denying God an opportunity. And that's a hard thing to think through, because how do you do that? How do you know when what you're getting is the provision of the Lord? And so it's just, the only way you do that is spending time with God and listening and doing your part, but seeking the Lord. So I'm going to go through some of these, and I don't know if you have something to write on. We're running short on time, so I'm going to go through these quick. But there's a lot of verses that I'd love to be able to share. We talked a little bit about contentment before. Godliness with contentment is great gain. If we brought nothing into the world and we take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. And I think a lot of times what we seek when we're borrowing is to get more, to have a better house that maybe we can't afford, to provide for our children something that we may not be able to afford. And certainly we want to do all we can to do those things. But what leads us to do more than we can often is a lack of contentment. And then Paul goes on to say, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and have pierced themselves with many griefs. And we talked about this passage before, where Paul says contentment is a learned skill or trait. It isn't something, you don't reach contentment, you learn contentment. And so he learned how to be content in any circumstance that he was in. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. One of my favorite verses in 1 John, in verse 16, everything in the world, the cravings of sinful men, the lust of the eyes, and the boasting of what one has and does, do not come from the Father, but come from the world. So be careful what desires you are to have bigger, better, more, which isn't a bad thing to do to create a better life for yourself and your family. But just make sure where those desires are coming from, and what would be the best way to meet them. And maybe it's going to take more time and more hard work than taking shortcuts, which leads to the next verse. Good planning and hard work lead to prosperity, but hasty shortcuts lead to poverty. Another translation says steady plotting brings prosperity, and hasty speculation leads to poverty. Let's go. Another passage in Luke. Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Man's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions. So the last few minutes, I'll just kind of talk through. Hopefully a lot of you are not in that situation and are able to keep working and have good cash flow margin. But if you're not, or maybe if you know someone who's not, then here's maybe some next steps to think about. So recovering from financial distress, which may be from debt, it may just be from lack of income because of COVID. But the first thing you do is pray for ask wisdom. In James chapter 1, it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. But he goes on to say, when you pray, believe and don't doubt. So pray and ask for wisdom and trust that you'll get it. You may not see a writing on the wall. You may not have a voice, but somebody may come into your life that is, a very wise person. Or you might find it from your Bible study. So just pray and really ask for wisdom because God's promised it. So let's claim that. So that's the first way to really see if God will provide, is to seek him first. Find resources. I shared some resources last week and I'll share them again after this, but Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover is a great, particularly if you're in distress, that's an excellent resource, and in my opinion, maybe the best for people who are in distress. Ask for help. And you can ask for help for advice, but you can also ask for financial assistance, particularly if you've been impacted by COVID. The church has resources. They know people with resources, and so they might help you with some ideas, but they might help you with some cash. So don't let your pride deny someone the opportunity of the blessing of helping. Some people are not financially impacted, and they're looking for ways to help people. And, when we'll talk about next week that it's more blessed to give than to receive, it is a blessing. And people feel blessed by being able to help. So don't rob people's blessing by having the pride of not asking for help. So ask for help. But also commit to doing the hard work. So it's going to take as much work, if not more, to get out, and more time than it took you to get into trouble. So do the hard work, but also trust that through God, you can do more than you can ask, or that God can do more than you can ask or imagine, and believe that he will, but he's not going to do it if you're not seeking him and if you're not doing your part. So do the hard work, seek God, and trust that he'll do something more than you can ask or imagine. Consider bringing somebody in to hold you accountable. If you're married, it could be your spouse, but it could be somebody else. If you have somebody that you feel close to and trust, tell them about your situation and ask them to hold you accountable, and just meet and discuss it periodically, and make a plan. We talked about the financial planning process. The first thing is figure out where you are. You may know you're in bad shape, but write down how much you owe, what your assets are, how much your income is and how much your outflow is. Put it on paper. And that may be something, if you're not a financial person, that you could get help with, but figure out where you are. And then based on where you are, set some goals. Maybe your goal is, to be in a better place, even if it's not where you want to be, but just be in a better place, and make them long-term goals. I think, the first time Mindy and I had a financial plan done 25 years ago, we were doing this. We were doing our best to spend less than we earned, but we could seem to never make progress. But what we did was the financial plan showed us, if we kept doing what we were doing, where we would be in 10 years. So when we looked 1 month, 2 months, even 6 months, he said that was just really discouraging because it didn't seem like we were getting anywhere. But as the plan showed us where we would be in 10 years, and say, okay, that's something that is exciting and we can do. So set those long-term goals and have a long-term vision. Somebody may need to help you do that, but have those long-term goals, and it's really can be encouraging. And not long ago, I actually found that financial plan from 25 years ago, and I thought where we were going to be in 10 years, so 15 years ago, because we were diligent to stay on track, we surpassed that way faster than we really thought was even possible, because we didn't always do it right, and we failed more than we succeeded. But as Mindy shared last week, we always knew where the track was. And as we veered off back and forth, we always knew where the track was, and we had this goal we were shooting for, and we were able to accomplish it and continue to do that. So once you set those goals, then figure out, how can I create the cash flow margin to help me meet those goals? And I might not be able to have the cash flow margin to do it now. It may take a while, but until you take steps to increase it, you're never going to be able to do it. So don't be discouraged by where you are, or even where you'll be in 3 to 6 months. Look long-term and start making steps. And then once you figure out where your cash flow margin can be, then figure out a system to help you manage it. And that, again, to me, is the hardest part. And then start the process over. It's a circular thing that never stops. We had our first financial plan 25 years ago, but we're doing it ongoing. We continue to do it on a regular basis. So as we close, here are some resources that I mentioned last week. Your Money Made Simple is a free Kindle version on Amazon. Financial Hope, product of Michael Blue, Ron Blue Institute, is available on Amazon. MoneyWise is a great radio show, but they've got free resources on their website. Compass is same thing. Ron Blue Institute also has great resources. But so, if you have, I'll show you my number in a minute. If you didn't get these or want any of those resources, let me know. But if you're in financial distress, my opinion, this is your best resource, is Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover. Take the class, it'd be awesome. But even if you can't take the class, buy the book. Listen to his radio show. I think one thing that's encouraging, if you're listening to his radio show, you're going to find and hear about people that are in worse shape than you are that got out of it. And you'll hear them week after week after week. So it's just encouraging to hear people that are taking control and doing the baby steps and are finding success. So, if you are, whether you're in a great place and just want to get better, or if you're in deep financial distress, step one, always pray and seek God. So we got right up to the 12 o'clock deadline. Sorry, I didn't have much time for questions, but if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to dive in now. There's